What if the person you trusted most was slowly poisoning your life, and everyone around you insisted it was all in your head? What if the very ground beneath your feet, your own home, became a battleground where reality itself was questioned? This is the story of how I discovered that sometimes the most dangerous predators hide behind loving smiles, and how a single lab report changed everything I thought I knew about my family. My name is Klaye Smith, and for 2 years, I lived in a nightmare disguised as suburban normalcy. This is how I fought my way back to the truth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows of our colonial house on Maple Ridge Drive, casting everything in that golden glow that makes ordinary moments feel almost magical. I was 22, fresh out of college with my communications degree, and living back home in Westfield, Connecticut, while I figured out my next move. Most of my friends had scattered across the country for jobs or graduate school, but I'd chosen to stay close to family during what felt like a transitional period in my life. Mom was at the stove, her auburn hair pulled back in the same messy bun she'd worn every morning for as long as I could remember. She hummed quietly some old Fleetwood Mac song while scrambling eggs. The familiar domestic scene should have been comforting, but lately mornings felt different, heavy somehow. "Coffee's ready, sweetheart," came the voice from behind me. Richard Castellano had been my stepfather for 3 years now, ever since he and Mom got married when I was 19. He was a successful insurance adjuster, well-liked in our community, always ready with a warm smile and a helping hand for neighbors. At 45, he had the kind of steady, dependable presence that had probably attracted my mother after years of raising me alone following my father's death when I was 12. I turned to see him holding out my favorite mug, a ceramic piece I'd made in a college pottery class, painted with sunflowers. It was a thoughtful gesture, the kind of small kindness that had made me genuinely happy when Mom first started dating him. Richard had made an effort to connect with me from the beginning, remembering little details about my preferences, asking about my studies, treating me like the daughter he'd never had. "Thanks, Richard," I said, accepting the mug. The coffee smelled perfect, that rich, dark roast I loved with just a hint of vanilla creamer. Richard had quickly learned everyone's preferences in our household. Mom liked her coffee black and strong. I preferred mine with cream and a touch of sweetness. He took his with sugar, no cream. "Sleep well?" he asked, settling into his usual chair at our round kitchen table. The morning ritual had become so routine over the past few months. Richard would wake up first, start the coffee, then call us down for breakfast before he headed to his office in downtown Hartford. "Pretty well," I lied, taking a sip of the coffee. It tasted exactly right, as always. Richard had a talent for consistency. The truth was, I hadn't been sleeping well at all lately. For the past several weeks, I'd been waking up groggy and disoriented, sometimes with gaps in my memory about the evening before. I had attributed it to stress, the post-graduation anxiety, the pressure of job hunting, the general uncertainty about my future. Most people my age went through similar struggles, I reasoned. Mom joined us at the table with her own coffee and a plate of toast. "Any plans for today, honey?" "I've got that interview at the marketing firm in New Haven, the one I told you about last week." "That's wonderful." Richard's face lit up with genuine pride. "You're going to do great. You've got that natural charisma. People are drawn to you. It's a gift." His encouragement felt sincere, and I found myself smiling despite my general malaise. Richard had always been supportive of my ambitions, often more vocally than Mom, who tended to worry about practical things like health insurance and steady paychecks. "What time is your interview?" Mom asked, buttering her toast with mechanical precision. 2:00. I figured I'd leave around noon to account for traffic. "Smart thinking," Richard nodded approvingly. "That drive can be unpredictable, especially midweek." I took another long sip of coffee, appreciating the warmth and caffeine. Lately, I'd been depending on that morning coffee more than usual. It seemed to be the only thing that helped clear the mental fog I'd been experiencing. Without it, I felt like I was moving through the world underwater. Richard continued, my buddy Jake works in marketing up in Hartford. If this New Haven thing doesn't work out, I could always put in a word for you. That's really sweet of you to offer. And I meant it. Richard's network of professional contacts had been invaluable as I navigated the job market. He seemed to know someone in every industry, always willing to make introductions or provide recommendations. The conversation flowed easily, covering the usual topics: Mom's work at the local elementary school where she taught 4th grade, Richard's current cases, my ongoing job search, weekend plans. It was the picture of a normal, functional family sharing breakfast before starting their respective days. Yet underneath the surface normalcy, I couldn't shake a persistent feeling of unease. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint exactly. Richard had never been anything but kind to me. He treated Mom with genuine affection and respect. He'd seamlessly integrated into our lives without trying to replace my father or overstep boundaries. By all external measures, Mom had found herself a good man after years of single parenthood. So why did I sometimes feel like a stranger in my own life? The feeling was subtle but persistent, like walking into a room and forgetting why you'd entered, or having a word on the tip of your tongue that never quite surfaces. Sometimes I'd catch myself in the middle of a conversation, unsure how we'd arrived at that particular topic. Other times I'd find items in my room that I didn't remember moving, or discover I'd made plans I couldn't recall making. I'd mentioned these concerns to Mom a few times, but she'd dismiss them as normal post-college adjustment stress. You're overthinking things, sweetheart, she'd say with that patient smile she reserved for what she considered my tendency toward mild hypochondria. Your brain is just processing a lot of changes right now. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was overthinking things. I finished my coffee and headed upstairs to get ready for the interview, choosing a navy blue blazer and matching skirt. Professional, but not stuffy. In the mirror, I looked capable and put together, though I noticed the slight shadows under my eyes that concealer couldn't quite hide. The interview went well, or at least I thought it did. The marketing director, a woman named Sarah Chen, seemed impressed with my portfolio and asked thoughtful questions about my experience and career goals. We connected over our shared interest in digital storytelling, and the conversation flowed naturally for over an hour. But driving home, I realized I could barely remember specific details of our discussion. I knew it had gone well. I had that general positive feeling. But when I tried to recall particular questions she'd asked or responses I'd given, everything felt hazy and indistinct. I pulled over at a rest stop and sat in my car, trying to piece together the timeline of my day. I remembered leaving the house around noon. I remembered arriving at the office building and taking the elevator to the 3rd floor. I remembered Sarah greeting me warmly and leading me to a conference room with large windows overlooking a courtyard. But the middle part, the actual substance of the interview, felt like trying to remember a dream. The harder I concentrated, the more elusive the details became. Maybe I was more nervous than I'd realized, I told myself. Job interviews could be stressful, and stress could affect memory. It was probably nothing to worry about. By the time I got home, it was nearly 5 o'clock. Mom was in the garden tending to her tomato plants, and Richard was reading in his favorite armchair in the living room. "How'd it go?" he called out as I walked through the front door. "Good, I think. Really good, actually." "That's fantastic. Tell me all about it." I found myself recounting the interview in broad strokes. The office atmosphere, Sarah's friendliness, the positive tone of the conversation. But even as I spoke, I felt like I was describing someone else's experience, relying more on general impressions than specific memories. Richard listened with genuine interest, asking follow-up questions and offering encouragement. His enthusiasm felt authentic, and I appreciated having someone who believed in my potential. "I have a good feeling about this one," he said, reaching over to squeeze my shoulder in a paternal gesture. "You've got something special, Klaye. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." That evening, we ordered Chinese takeout and watched a movie together, some romantic comedy Mom had been wanting to see. It should have been a perfect end to a promising day, but I found myself struggling to follow the plot. My attention kept drifting, and I'd catch myself staring blankly at the screen, unsure how much time had passed. "You seem tired, sweetheart," Mom observed during a commercial break. "Why don't you head to bed early tonight?" "Yeah, I think I will," I agreed, realizing I did feel unusually drained despite having done nothing more strenuous than sit in a conference room for an hour. As I headed upstairs, Richard called after me, "Sweet dreams, kiddo. Tomorrow's going to be a great day." I wanted to believe him. Standing in my childhood bedroom, looking at the familiar posters and books and keepsakes from simpler times, I tried to convince myself that everything was fine. I was just adjusting to adult life. The grogginess, the memory lapses, and the general sense of disconnection, these were normal growing pains. But as I settled into bed that night, one thought kept circling through my mind like a persistent whisper. What if something was really wrong? And if it was, would anyone believe me? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. 3 weeks after the New Haven interview, which I eventually got, starting as a junior marketing coordinator, I began working regular office hours for the first time in my adult life. The structured schedule should have helped regulate my sleep patterns and energy levels, but instead the mysterious symptoms I'd been experiencing seemed to intensify. My new colleagues at Morrison & Associates were welcoming and professional. Sarah Chen, the marketing director who'd hired me, assigned me to work on social media campaigns for local businesses. The work was engaging and creative, exactly the kind of entry-level position I'd hoped to find. I should have been thriving. Instead, I found myself struggling to maintain focus during afternoon meetings. By 3 o'clock each day, I felt like I was swimming upstream against an invisible current of exhaustion. My supervisor, a kind woman named Jennifer Walsh, noticed my afternoon slumps and suggested I might need to adjust my caffeine intake. "Sometimes too much coffee can actually make you more tired," she said during one of our weekly check-ins. "Have you considered switching to green tea in the afternoons?" I nodded and made appropriate responses, but internally I was calculating my daily caffeine consumption. 1 cup of coffee in the morning at home with Richard and Mom, maybe a second cup during my lunch break if I was feeling particularly sluggish. It didn't seem excessive, especially compared to some of my coworkers who seemed to live on espresso. The real turning point came on a Thursday evening in late September. I'd stopped at the grocery store after work to pick up ingredients for dinner. Mom had been working late on parent conferences all week, and I'd volunteered to cook. It was a simple gesture, a way to contribute to the household and show appreciation for Richard and Mom letting me live at home while I got established in my career. I was pushing my cart through the produce section, selecting vegetables for a stir-fry, when I ran into someone I hadn't seen in months, my college roommate Jessica Martinez. "Klaye, oh my God, I can't believe it's you!" Jessica practically shrieked, abandoning her own cart to give me an enthusiastic hug. "You look... Wow, are you okay?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" Jessica stepped back, steadying my face with the kind of scrutiny that only comes from someone who's known you intimately. We'd shared a dorm room for 2 years, staying up late talking about everything from career ambitions to relationship drama. She knew my expressions better than most people. "You look exhausted," she said bluntly. "And you've lost weight. When's the last time you had a full physical?" I started to brush off her concern with the same explanations I'd been giving myself, but Jessica wasn't buying it. She'd always been the more practical and health-conscious of the two of us, the one who insisted on regular doctor visits and actually read the nutrition labels on food packages. "Seriously, Klaye, something's off. Your eyes look different, kind of unfocused. And you're moving really slowly." Now that she mentioned it, I realized I had been moving more slowly than usual. Simple tasks like grocery shopping or organizing my workspace at the office seemed to require more effort than they should. I'd attributed it to the adjustment period of starting a new job, but hearing Jessica's observations from an outside perspective made me question that assumption. I've been having some trouble sleeping, and I feel kind of foggy during the day sometimes, but I just started working full-time, so I figured it was stress. Jessica's expression shifted from casual concern to something more serious. Klaye, that's not normal stress. I mean, I started working 60-hour weeks right after graduation, and yeah, I was tired, but not like this. You seem, I don't know how to describe it, disconnected? We talked for another 20 minutes in that grocery aisle, Jessica pressing me for details about my daily routine, my energy levels, my eating habits. The more questions she asked, the more I realized how many aspects of my life had gradually shifted without my conscious awareness. I was sleeping 10 to 12 hours a night, but waking up feeling unrested. I was eating smaller portions because food often tasted bland or unappetizing. I was having trouble following complex conversations, especially in group settings. I'd stopped reading books in the evenings because I couldn't concentrate on the words. Listen, Jessica said finally, I'm probably overreacting, but will you do me a favor? Will you see a doctor? Just to rule out anything obvious like anemia or thyroid problems? I promised I would, though I wasn't sure I meant it. The idea of making a doctor's appointment felt overwhelming, like another task to add to a list that already felt unmanageable. That night at dinner, I mentioned running into Jessica and our conversation. I expected Mom and Richard to share Jessica's concern, but their reactions were surprisingly dismissive. Jessica was always a bit dramatic, Mom said, twirling spaghetti around her fork. Remember in college when she convinced herself she had mono just because she was tired during finals week? Richard nodded sagely. Some people are just more anxious about health stuff. You look fine to me, kiddo. Maybe a little thin, but you young women are always worried about your weight anyway. Their casual dismissal of Jessica's observations stung more than I expected. I'd been hoping for validation, maybe even encouragement to take better care of myself. Instead, I felt like my concerns were being minimized. But maybe Jessica has a point, I pressed. I have been feeling pretty run down lately. Honey, Mom said, reaching across the table to pat my hand, you just started your first real job. That's a huge adjustment. Your body and mind are adapting to a completely new routine. It's perfectly normal to feel tired and a little overwhelmed. Exactly, Richard chimed in. Plus, you're living at home, which probably feels weird after 4 years of independence in college. There are a lot of psychological factors at play here. Their explanations sounded reasonable, even compassionate. They knew me well, after all. They saw me every day. If something was seriously wrong, wouldn't they notice? But as the conversation moved on to other topics, I found myself thinking about Jessica's specific observations. The unfocused eyes, the slow movements, the sense of disconnection she'd picked up on immediately after not seeing me for months. 2 days later, I made an appointment with Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the family physician I'd been seeing since high school. It was partly to honor my promise to Jessica, but mostly because Jessica's comments had planted a seed of genuine worry. Dr. Hendricks was a thorough, no-nonsense woman in her 50s, who'd known me since I was 16. She listened carefully as I described my symptoms, the fatigue, the concentration problems, the memory lapses, the general feeling of being slightly removed from my own life. Let's start with some basic blood work, she said, after a comprehensive physical exam that revealed nothing obviously abnormal. We'll check your complete blood count, thyroid function, vitamin levels, blood sugar, the usual suspects for fatigue and cognitive issues. Do you think something's really wrong? I asked as she prepared the blood draw. Probably not anything serious, she said, her tone professionally reassuring. But you're right to pay attention to how you're feeling. Sometimes our bodies are trying to tell us something. The blood draw was routine, but as I watched the dark red liquid fill the vials, I felt a strange sense of anticipation mixed with dread. Part of me hoped the tests would reveal something concrete, anemia, a vitamin deficiency, hypothyroidism, something with a clear diagnosis and treatment plan. Another part of me worried that the tests would come back completely normal,
leaving me back where I started with unexplained symptoms and growing self-doubt. Dr. Hendricks said the results would be available within a few days, and she'd call with the findings. I left her office feeling simultaneously proactive and anxious, like I'd set something in motion without knowing where it would lead. That evening, Richard had prepared my coffee as usual, and I accepted it gratefully. The warm mug felt comforting in my hands, and the familiar taste provided a small anchor of normalcy in what was becoming an increasingly confusing situation. "How did your doctor's visit go?" he asked, settling into his chair with his own coffee. "Fine, I think. She's running some blood tests, just to be thorough." "That's smart," he said approvingly. "It never hurts to get a clean bill of health. I'm sure everything will come back perfectly normal." His confidence was reassuring, but as I sipped my coffee, I found myself paying attention to details I'd never noticed before. The way Richard always prepared the coffee before calling me and Mom down for breakfast. The way he always handed me my specific mug, never letting me serve myself. The way he seemed to know exactly how I liked my coffee prepared, even though I'd never explicitly given him detailed instructions. These weren't necessarily suspicious observations, just things I was noticing with a new awareness, sparked by Jessica's comments and my doctor's visit. Richard was naturally attentive and considerate. He paid attention to people's preferences. These were positive qualities, not red flags. But for the first time, I found myself consciously noting these patterns, filing them away in some corner of my mind that was slowly awakening to the possibility that my normal might not be as normal as everyone insisted. The call from Dr. Hendricks came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at work reviewing social media analytics for a local bakery client. I stepped into an empty conference room to take the call, my heart racing with anticipation. "Klaye, I have your blood work results," Dr. Hendricks said, her tone neutral and professional. "Everything looks normal. Your thyroid function is excellent, no signs of anemia, your vitamin levels are all within healthy ranges, and your blood sugar is stable." The word normal should have been reassuring, but instead it left me feeling strangely deflated. "So, there's nothing wrong with me?" "From a medical standpoint, you're in good health," she confirmed. "Sometimes fatigue and concentration issues can be related to stress, sleep quality, or other lifestyle factors that don't show up in blood tests. Have you considered seeing a counselor? Sometimes talking through life transitions can help with the symptoms you're experiencing." After hanging up, I sat alone in that conference room for several minutes, staring out the window at the parking lot below. The rational part of my brain was relieved. No underlying disease, no serious medical condition, no cause for alarm. But another part of me felt frustrated and confused. If nothing was medically wrong, why did I feel so disconnected from my own life? Maybe everyone was right. Maybe I was overthinking things, creating problems where none existed. Maybe the transition from college to adult life was just harder for me than for other people. That evening, I shared the test results with Mom and Richard over dinner. Their reactions were exactly what I expected. Relief mixed with a gentle, "I told you so," undertone. "See," Mom said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "I knew it was just stress. You put too much pressure on yourself, sweetheart. Always have, even as a little girl." Richard nodded sympathetically. "Your mom's right. You're a perfectionist, Klaye. Sometimes that means you're hyper-aware of every little change in how you feel. Most people wouldn't even notice the things you're worried about." Their explanations made sense, and I wanted to believe them. It would be so much easier to accept that I was simply being overly sensitive, that my concerns were the product of an anxious mind rather than something genuinely problematic. But over the next few weeks, I found myself caught in an internal battle between acceptance and persistent unease. During the day at work, I tried to embrace the "it's just stress" narrative. I made efforts to be more social with my coworkers, joining them for lunch, and participating in office conversations with forced enthusiasm. Jennifer Walsh, my supervisor, seemed pleased with my improved engagement. "You seem much more like yourself lately," she commented during one of our weekly check-ins. "More present and focused. Whatever you're doing to manage your stress, keep it up." Her observation was encouraging, and I began to think maybe I really was getting better, that whatever had been bothering me was resolving on its own. Maybe Mom and Richard had been right all along. I just needed time to adjust. But the evenings at home told a different story. As soon as I walked through the front door on Maple Ridge Drive, that familiar fog would descend. The mental clarity I managed to maintain at work would evaporate, replaced by the same dreamy disconnection I'd been experiencing for months. I started paying closer attention to the timing of these episodes. The pattern was remarkably consistent. I'd feel relatively sharp and focused until I got home, had dinner with Mom and Richard, and settled into our evening routine. By bedtime, I'd be struggling to follow television plots or remember what I'd done earlier that day. One evening in early October, I decided to conduct a small experiment. Instead of accepting Richard's offer of after-dinner coffee, which had become a nightly ritual, I politely declined, claiming I was trying to reduce my caffeine intake to improve my sleep quality. Richard seemed slightly taken aback by my refusal, but he quickly recovered with his usual understanding smile. "That's probably smart, kiddo. Too much caffeine can definitely mess with your sleep cycle." That night, for the first time in months, I remained mentally alert until bedtime. I was able to finish an entire chapter of a novel I'd been struggling to read for weeks. I followed every plot twist in the movie Mom had chosen. I participated meaningfully in our family conversation about weekend plans. The difference was subtle, but noticeable, at least to me. When I mentioned feeling more clear-headed that evening, Mom attributed it to my reduced caffeine intake. "See? You're learning to take better care of yourself," she said approvingly. "Sometimes it's the simplest changes that make the biggest difference."
But I was beginning to suspect the explanation might be more complex than that. The next evening, I accepted Richard's coffee again, curious to see if the mental fog would return. Within an hour of finishing the cup, I felt that familiar drift back into disconnection. I tried the same experiment several more times over the following weeks, always with the same results. Coffee evenings left me feeling spacey and unfocused. Non-coffee evenings, I remained sharp and present. The obvious conclusion would be that I was simply sensitive to evening caffeine, but something about that explanation didn't sit right with me. I'd been drinking coffee in the evenings for years without problems. Why would I suddenly develop a sensitivity now? More puzzling was the fact that morning coffee, the cup Richard prepared for me each day before work, didn't seem to have the same effect. If anything, that morning coffee helped me feel more alert and focused for the first part of my workday. I mentioned my observations to Jessica during one of our now regular phone calls. Since our encounter at the grocery store, she'd been checking in on me weekly, monitoring my health with the persistence of someone who genuinely cared about my well-being. "That's interesting," she said when I described the coffee-related pattern I'd noticed. "Have you tried switching to decaf in the evenings? Or maybe drinking regular coffee at different times of day to see if the timing matters?" Her suggestions made sense, but when I brought up the idea of switching to decaf evening coffee, Richard seemed oddly resistant to the idea. "Decaf just doesn't taste the same," he said, frowning slightly. "Besides, if regular coffee is bothering you that much, maybe you should just skip the evening coffee altogether. I don't want you to feel like you have to drink it just to be polite." His response struck me as strange. If he was genuinely concerned about my comfort, why not simply buy some decaf coffee to accommodate my apparent sensitivity? It wasn't an expensive or complicated solution. But when I suggested we could keep both regular and decaf in the house, he dismissed the idea as unnecessary complication. "We'd just end up with 2 half-empty containers taking up space in the cabinet," he said. "Let's keep things simple."
I found myself wondering why he seemed invested in me either drinking his regular coffee or not drinking coffee at all, rather than finding a middle ground that might work better for me. It was a small thing, probably not worth analyzing, but it added to a growing collection of minor inconsistencies that I couldn't quite shake. Around the same time, I started having what I can only describe as moments of clarity. Brief periods where the fog would lift unexpectedly, and I'd see my situation with unusual sharpness. These moments usually occurred at work, during my lunch break when I was away from home for several hours. During one such moment, I found myself making a list in my work notebook, not for any client project, but for my own reference. I wrote down every symptom I'd been experiencing, every pattern I'd noticed, every conversation that had seemed off or dismissive. The list was longer than I expected. Memory lapses, especially in the evenings, difficulty concentrating after dinner, unexplained fatigue despite adequate sleep, loss of appetite and weight loss, feeling disconnected from conversations and activities, normal blood work results, symptoms worse on days when I drank evening coffee, family dismissive of concerns, Richard's resistance to coffee alternatives. Looking at everything written out objectively, I realized I had two choices. I could continue accepting everyone's explanations that this was normal stress and adjustment anxiety, or I could trust my own perceptions and investigate further. The safe choice was acceptance. It would preserve family harmony, avoid conflict, and allow me to move forward without questioning the people I loved and trusted most. The risky choice was to keep digging, to trust that my body and mind were trying to tell me something important, even if I couldn't yet understand what that something might be. That night, I went home and accepted Richard's evening coffee with a smile, but for the first time, I was drinking it as a conscious choice, rather than a passive acceptance of routine. I was beginning to understand that if I wanted real answers, I might have to find them myself.
The decision to take action came on a rainy Thursday evening in late October. I'd been documenting my symptoms and observations for 2 weeks, and the patterns in my notebook were becoming impossible to ignore. More importantly, I'd stumbled upon something that changed everything. I was working late at the office, finishing up a campaign proposal for a new client, when I decided to research my symptoms online. I'd avoided doing this before, partly because Mom and Richard had discouraged what they called self-diagnosing on the internet, and partly because I was afraid of what I might find. But sitting alone in the quiet office with the rain drumming against the windows, I opened my laptop and typed memory loss fatigue concentration problems into the search bar. Most of the results were what I expected. Articles about stress, depression, sleep disorders, and various medical conditions. But buried on the third page of results was an article from a toxicology journal that made my blood run cold. Identifying covert chemical exposure, common household substances used in domestic poisoning cases. The article was written for medical professionals, dense with technical language, but certain phrases jumped out at me. Gradual cognitive impairment, memory fragmentation, victims often unaware of exposure, symptoms dismissed as psychological or stress-related. I scrolled through the list of commonly used substances. Some were exotic chemicals I'd never heard of, but others were surprisingly mundane, things that could be found in any household. One section specifically discussed substances that could be dissolved in beverages without detection. My hands started shaking as I read about something called temazepam, a prescription sleep medication that when used inappropriately could cause exactly the symptoms I'd been experiencing. The article explained that small, repeated doses could create a state of chronic, mild sedation that victims might not recognize as abnormal, especially if the dosing was consistent enough to feel like their normal state. I slammed my laptop shut, my heart racing. This was crazy. I was letting my imagination run wild, seeing sinister explanations for what everyone assured me were normal stress symptoms.
People didn't get drugged by their own family members. That was the stuff of movies and crime shows, not suburban Connecticut households. But I couldn't stop thinking about Richard's coffee rituals, the way he always prepared my morning and evening cups personally, the way he seemed uncomfortable when I suggested alternatives or tried to serve myself, the way my symptoms followed such a precise pattern related to when and what I drank. I sat in my car in the office parking lot for 20 minutes, rain streaming down the windshield, trying to decide what to do next. The rational part of my brain insisted I was being paranoid and ridiculous. Richard loved me. He'd been nothing but supportive and kind since entering our family. He had no motive to hurt me. But another part of my brain, a part that was growing stronger and clearer, whispered that love and harm weren't mutually exclusive, and that motives weren't always obvious or logical. I drove home through the rain, my mind made up about one thing. I needed proof, one way or another. If I was wrong, I'd know I was being paranoid and could get help for whatever was causing me to have these suspicions. If I was right, I didn't want to think about what it would mean if I was right. The next morning, I woke up early and went downstairs before Richard started his usual coffee routine. I wanted to observe the process more carefully than I ever had before. "Morning, kiddo," he said, seeming slightly surprised to see me in the kitchen ahead of schedule. "You're up early today." I said couldn't sleep, which was true. I'd spent most of the night alternating between reading articles about covert drugging and convincing myself I was losing my mind. I watched as Richard went through his morning coffee routine. He seemed slightly less comfortable with me hovering nearby, but he maintained his usual cheerful demeanor. He prepared 3 mugs, Mom's black coffee, his own with sugar, and mine with cream. What I noticed for the first time was that he prepared the coffees in a specific order, and he turned slightly away from me when adding the final touches to each cup. It was subtle, probably something I'd never have noticed if I weren't specifically watching for it, but it was there. When he handed me my mug, the familiar sunflower ceramic piece, I thanked him and took a small sip, then excused myself to get ready for work. Instead of drinking the coffee, I went upstairs and poured it down the bathroom sink, rinsing the mug thoroughly. At work that day, I felt more alert and focused than I had in months. By lunchtime, I was convinced that skipping the morning coffee had made a difference. But I needed more than my own subjective impressions. I needed objective evidence. During my lunch break, I drove to a pharmacy across town and purchased a home drug testing kit. The pharmacist explained that it could detect various substances in urine, including prescription medications. I felt like I was living in someone else's life as I made the purchase, but I was committed to finding out the truth. That evening, I implemented what I thought of as my collection plan. I accepted Richard's evening coffee with my usual smile, but instead of drinking it, I discreetly transferred it to a thermos I'd hidden in my room. I did this for 3 consecutive evenings, storing the coffee samples in sealed containers in my car trunk. On the 4th evening, I also collected a urine sample following the instructions from the home testing kit. The whole process felt surreal and invasive, like I was violating some fundamental trust, but I forced myself to continue. The home test results came back positive for benzodiazepines, specifically the same class of drugs I'd read about in that toxicology article. I stared at the test strip, comparing it to the color chart provided in the kit, checking and rechecking the results. There it was, in undeniable chemical reality. I had benzodiazepines in my system, and I had no prescription for any such medication. I sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot, holding the test results, trying to process what this meant. Either I was somehow accidentally ingesting prescription drugs, or someone was giving them to me intentionally. Given the careful patterns I had observed around Richard's coffee preparation, accidental exposure seemed unlikely. The magnitude of what I was considering hit me like a physical blow. If Richard was drugging my coffee, it meant that for months, maybe longer, I'd been living in a chemically altered state. It meant that every interaction, every conversation, Every moment of our family life had been built on a foundation of deception and violation. But I still needed more proof. The home test could have been faulty. The coffee samples might not reveal anything conclusive. I needed professional confirmation before I could make such a devastating accusation. I drove directly from the parking lot to an independent laboratory I'd found online, one that offered confidential testing services. I paid in cash and submitted the coffee samples under a false name, requesting a comprehensive analysis for any foreign substances. The lab technician, a woman named Carol, who seemed accustomed to unusual requests, explained that results would be available within 48 hours. She didn't ask why I needed coffee tested for drugs, and I was grateful for her professional discretion. Those 2 days were the longest of my life. I continued my normal routine, going to work, having family dinners, accepting Richard's coffee while secretly disposing of it, all while feeling like I was living in a dangerous performance. Richard seemed to notice that I was more energetic and alert than usual, but he attributed it to positive changes in my routine. "You seem like you're really hitting your stride at work," he commented one evening. "I'm proud of how well you're adapting to adult life." His praise, which once would have made me feel warm and appreciated, now felt like sandpaper against my skin. If my suspicions were correct, his kindness was not just fake, it was actively malicious. When Carol called with the test results, I was at work, sitting in the same conference room where I'd taken Dr. Hendricks's call about my blood work. "I have your results," she said in the same neutral tone all medical professionals seem to use. "The samples you submitted tested positive for tepanzepam at concentrations that would be consistent with therapeutic dosing if taken orally. There were no other foreign substances detected." Tepanzepam. The same drug I'd read about in that toxicology article, a prescription sleep medication that could cause exactly the symptoms I'd been experiencing. "Is there any way this could be a false positive?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Our testing procedures are quite reliable," Carol said. "The concentrations were significant and consistent across all 3 samples. Someone definitely added this medication to whatever you submitted for testing." After hanging up, I sat in that conference room for a long time, staring at the wall and trying to accept what I now knew with scientific certainty. Richard had been drugging my coffee. For months, he'd been systematically medicating me without my knowledge or consent, altering my mental state, affecting my memory and concentration, and then dismissing my concerns when I tried to talk about how I was feeling. The betrayal was so profound that I felt physically sick, but underneath the nausea and disbelief, I felt something else, a fierce, burning clarity that I hadn't experienced in months. I finally had proof. Now I had to decide what to do with it. Having proof that Richard was drugging my coffee was one thing. Figuring out what to do with that knowledge was another challenge entirely. I couldn't simply walk into our kitchen the next morning and confront him with lab results. I needed a strategy, and I needed allies who would believe me. My first instinct was to call Jessica, but when I actually picked up the phone, I found myself paralyzed. How do you tell someone that your stepfather has been systematically poisoning you? It sounded insane, even in my own head. Jessica had been supportive of my health concerns, but this was a massive leap from "you seem tired" to "your family member is committing a serious crime." Instead, I decided to start with someone who might have more objective authority, Dr. Hendricks. I called her office and requested an urgent appointment, telling the receptionist I had new information about my symptoms that couldn't wait for a regular checkup. Dr. Hendricks saw me that same afternoon. I brought copies of the lab reports, my symptom journal, and a detailed timeline of everything I had observed over the past few weeks. She listened without interruption as I explained my suspicions and the evidence I'd gathered. When she finished, she was quiet for a long moment, studying the lab reports with the careful attention of someone who understands their significance. "These are definitely concerning results," said she, finally. "Temazepam at these concentrations would absolutely explain your symptoms. The question is how it got into your system." I appreciated that she didn't immediately dismiss my suspicions as paranoid delusions. At the same time, her clinical approach made me realize how serious the situation really was. "What should I do?" I asked. Dr. Hendricks leaned back in her chair, clearly considering multiple factors. From a medical standpoint, you need to stop consuming whatever is contaminated, which you've already done. From a legal and safety standpoint, this is more complicated. If someone is deliberately giving you medication without your knowledge, that's a crime. But proving intent and protecting yourself requires careful planning. She recommended that I document everything I discovered so far and consider involving law enforcement. She also suggested I might want to stay somewhere else until the situation was resolved for my own safety. The person doing this has been able to observe your behavior and adjust their approach accordingly. If they realize you're aware of what's happening, they might escalate or change tactics. The idea that Richard might escalate hadn't occurred to me. I'd been so focused on gathering proof that I hadn't fully considered the implications of him discovering my investigation. Dr. Hendricks also did another blood draw, this one specifically to test for temazepam levels in my system, now that I'd been avoiding the contaminated coffee for several days. She explained that this would provide additional evidence of how the drug had been affecting me and potentially help establish a timeline. Leaving her office, I felt both validated and terrified. Having a medical professional take my concerns seriously was an enormous relief, but it also made the danger feel more real and immediate. That evening at home, I went through the motions of normal family life with a new awareness of how precarious my situation was. Richard seemed his usual caring self, asking about my day, offering to help me with anything I needed. But now I knew that this concerned stepfather act was a performance designed to hide something much darker. "You seem a little tense tonight, kiddo. Everything okay at work?" The casual concern in his voice made my skin crawl. He was monitoring my mood and energy levels because he needed to know how the drugs were affecting me. Every kind gesture, every moment of apparent care had been part of a calculated deception. "Just thinking about some projects," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Nothing major." But I could see him studying my face, noting my alertness, probably wondering why I seemed more focused than usual. I realized I needed to be more careful about hiding the changes in my behavior. The next day, I took a personal day from work and drove to the police station in downtown Westfield. I'd never been inside a police station before, and the institutional atmosphere was intimidating. The desk sergeant, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, listened as I explained I needed to report what I believed was ongoing drugging. He directed me to Detective Lisa Romano, a woman in her 40s who specialized in domestic crimes. Detective Romano had the no-nonsense demeanor I'd expected, but she also showed genuine concern as I presented my evidence. "This is actually more common than people realize," she said after reviewing my documentation. "Domestic partners using drugs to control or manipulate family members. The fact that you have professional lab results makes this a much stronger case than most we see." She explained the legal process for pursuing charges, but she also warned me about the challenges ahead. The person you're accusing will likely claim the medication was prescribed for you or that you took it voluntarily and forgot. They might suggest you're having mental health issues or memory problems caused by the drugs themselves.
This possibility hadn't occurred to me, but it made terrible sense. Richard could easily claim that he'd been trying to help me with sleep problems, or that I'd been taking the medication myself and become confused about how it got into my system. Detective Romano recommended that I gather additional evidence before making formal accusations. She suggested I might want to record conversations where Richard discussed my health or coffee routine, anything that might contradict a story about voluntary medication. "The more evidence you have of deceptive behavior, the harder it will be for him to claim innocent intentions," she explained. She also echoed Dr. Hendricks's concerns about my safety. If this person realizes you're aware of what they're doing, they might feel cornered. Cornered people sometimes make dangerous decisions. I left the police station with mixed feelings. It was encouraging to know that law enforcement took my situation seriously, but I was also beginning to understand how complex and potentially dangerous the path forward would be. That afternoon, I called Jessica and asked if she could meet me for coffee at a neutral location.
We met at a small cafe in downtown Hartford, far from anywhere I might accidentally encounter Richard or Mom. Jessica's reaction to my story was exactly what I'd hoped for: immediate belief and fierce, protective anger. "I knew something was seriously wrong," she said, gripping her coffee cup so tightly her knuckles were white. "When I saw you in the grocery store, you looked like you were sleepwalking through your own life." Having someone who knew me well validate my experience was enormously comforting. Jessica had seen the effects of the drugging before I even understood what was happening to me. "What can I do to help?" she asked immediately. We spent 2 hours planning my next steps. Jessica offered to let me stay at her apartment in New Haven if I needed to leave home quickly. She also volunteered to help me document anything else I might need for evidence. Most importantly, she helped me think through the conversation I would eventually need to have with Mom. Jessica had known my mother for years and understood the complex dynamics of our relationship. "Your mom loves you, but she's also invested in her marriage to Richard," she observed. "She might not want to believe something this serious about him, especially at first. You'll need to be prepared for her to be defensive or skeptical." This was perhaps the aspect of the situation I was dreading most. Mom had been through so much heartache after my father's death. She'd been alone for years before meeting Richard, and he'd brought stability and companionship back into her life. How could I ask her to consider that the man she'd married, the man who'd become a father figure to me, was actually a predator who'd been systematically harming her daughter? Jessica helped me practice different ways of approaching the conversation with Mom, but we both knew there was no easy way to deliver this kind of devastating news. As I drove home that evening, I realized I was entering a new phase of this nightmare. I was no longer just a victim trying to understand what was happening to me. I was now actively working to expose and stop someone who had been violating my autonomy and endangering my health for months. The evidence I gathered gave me strength, but it also made me acutely aware of how much I still had to lose. If my accusations weren't believed, or if I couldn't prove Richard's intent, I might end up destroying my relationship with Mom while achieving nothing. But I also knew I couldn't continue living in a house with someone who was drugging me. The knowledge of what he'd been doing made it impossible to feel safe in my own home. That night, I accepted Richard's evening coffee with a smile, then poured it down the sink when no one was looking. But this time, as I watched the contaminated liquid swirl down the drain, I wasn't just protecting myself. I was preparing for war.
I'd been carefully planning my approach to telling Mom about Richard's drugging for over a week when the decision was suddenly taken out of my hands. It happened on a Saturday morning in early November, and it changed everything in the worst possible way. I was in my room, organizing all my evidence into a folder: lab reports, symptom journals, photos of the coffee samples, printed emails from Dr. Hendricks, when I heard Mom and Richard talking downstairs. Their voices were too quiet for me to make out specific words, but something about the tone made me pause. Then I heard my name mentioned, and Richard's voice rose slightly with what sounded like concern. My stomach dropped as I realized they might be discussing my recent behavior. Had I been less careful about hiding my alertness than I thought? I crept to the top of the stairs and listened, my heart pounding. "She's been acting differently lately," Richard was saying. "More secretive, more anxious. And she's been turning down coffee in the evenings, which isn't like her." "Maybe she's just trying to sleep better," Mom replied. But I could hear uncertainty in her voice. "It's more than that, Claire. Yesterday, I saw her talking on the phone in her car in the driveway for over an hour. When she came in, she seemed startled when I asked who she'd been talking to. She said it was Jessica, but something felt off." My blood turned to ice. He'd been watching me, monitoring my behavior more closely than I'd realized. The conversation with Jessica about evidence collection had taken place in my car because I'd thought it was the safest place to talk privately. I'd been wrong. "You think something's wrong with her?" Mom asked, and now she sounded worried. "I think she might be having some kind of psychological episode," Richard said, his voice heavy with fake concern. "The symptoms she was describing a few months ago, the memory problems, the confusion, the paranoia about her health,
They could be signs of a mental health crisis. I gripped the banister, barely able to breathe. He was reframing my awareness of his drugging as evidence of mental illness. It was brilliant and terrifying. But her blood tests were normal, Mom said. Mental health issues don't always show up in blood tests, Richard replied smoothly. Sometimes stress or trauma can trigger psychological problems that manifest as physical symptoms. She's been under a lot of pressure lately. New job, living at home again after college, the transition to adult life. I wanted to run downstairs and confront him immediately, to show Mom all my evidence and expose his manipulation. But something held me back. Maybe intuition, maybe fear, maybe the strategic thinking Detective Romano had encouraged me to develop. Instead, I quietly returned to my room and texted Jessica. Emergency. Can you come over today? Bring everything we discussed. Jessica arrived within 2 hours, and I quickly filled her in on the conversation I had overheard. We decided that this forced our timeline. I needed to tell Mom everything today, before Richard could further poison her mind against me. Jessica agreed to stay as moral support and a witness, someone who could corroborate my story and provide an outside perspective on my mental state. We found Mom in the garden, deadheading her late-season roses. It was one of her favorite peaceful activities, and I hoped the familiar setting would help her hear what I had to say with an open mind. Mom, I need to talk to you about something really important, I said, settling onto the wooden bench beside her flower bed. She looked up from her roses, immediately sensing the seriousness in my tone. Of course, sweetheart. What's wrong? I took a deep breath and began with the most concrete evidence, the lab reports showing temazepam in my coffee samples. I explained my months of symptoms, my systematic investigation, and the professional confirmation from Dr. Hendricks and the independent laboratory. Mom's face went through several stages of reaction, confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked almost like fear. Klaye, this is a very serious accusation you're making. I know it is. That's why I made sure to get professional confirmation before saying anything. I showed her all my documentation, walking through the timeline of evidence. Jessica sat quietly beside me, occasionally nodding or adding small details about my behavior changes she had observed. But instead of the shock and protective anger I had expected, Mom's reaction was increasingly defensive. There has to be some other explanation, she said, studying the lab reports with a frown. Maybe the coffee got contaminated somehow. Maybe you accidentally took something and forgot about it.
Mom, look at the pattern, I said, trying to keep desperation out of my voice. The symptoms, the timing, the way Richard always prepares my coffee personally. And these lab results show therapeutic doses. Someone with medical knowledge did this deliberately. But I could see I was losing her. With each piece of evidence I presented, she seemed to retreat further into denial. Richard loves you, she said firmly. He's been nothing but good to both of us. He wouldn't hurt you, Klaye. This doesn't make any sense. Jessica tried to help by describing what she'd observed about my condition, but Mom brushed off her concerns. You saw Klaye a few times over several months, Mom said dismissively. I live with her every day. If something this serious was happening in my own house, don't you think I would have noticed? The conversation continued for over an hour, becoming increasingly painful and frustrating. Every piece of evidence I presented, Mom found ways to rationalize or dismiss. She suggested the lab might have made errors. She wondered if I might have been taking the medication for anxiety without remembering it clearly. She even suggested that my obsession with this theory was itself evidence of psychological problems. Maybe Richard is right, she said finally. And those 5 words felt like a physical blow. Maybe you are having some kind of mental health crisis. The paranoia, the elaborate theories, the secret investigations. This isn't like you, Klaye. It's exactly like me, I said, my voice rising with frustration. I'm being logical and systematic and careful, just like you taught me to be. I'm not making wild accusations. I have scientific evidence. But I could see it was hopeless.
Mom had already chosen to believe Richard's narrative over mine. In her mind, her husband's word carried more weight than her daughter's laboratory results. Jessica and I left that conversation feeling defeated and frightened. Not only had I failed to convince Mom, but I'd also revealed my hand to Richard by extension. He would know by tonight that I'd discovered his drugging and was actively working to expose him. That evening proved my fears correct. Richard's demeanor toward me had shifted dramatically. Gone was the warm, paternal kindness I'd grown accustomed to over the past 3 years. In its place was a cold calculation that made my skin crawl. "I understand you've been having some troubling thoughts lately," he said as we sat down for dinner. Mom had clearly told him about our conversation. "I've been having troubling experiences," I corrected. "Experiences that I now understand were caused by medication you put in my coffee." Richard's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. Anger, maybe? Or satisfaction that the pretense was finally over. "That's a very serious allegation, Klaye. The kind of allegation that could destroy a family. The kind of allegation that someone might make if they were experiencing paranoid delusions." Mom reached across the table and took his hand supportively. "We're worried about you, honey. Maybe it's time to consider getting some professional help." The betrayal was complete. My own mother was choosing to believe the man who'd been systematically drugging me over the evidence of her own daughter's careful investigation. "I've already gotten professional help," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Dr. Hendricks believes my evidence is credible. Detective Romano at the Westfield Police Department is taking my case seriously." This finally cracked Richard's composure slightly. The mention of police involvement clearly bothered him, though he recovered quickly. "I'm sure the police have to take all complaints seriously, regardless of their merit. But I hope you'll consider how pursuing false accusations might affect not just me, but your mother as well." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. He was warning me that continuing to pursue this would hurt Mom, that I would be responsible for destroying her happiness and security. After dinner, I retreated to my room and called Detective Romano to update her on the situation. She listened grimly as I described Mom's reaction and Richard's implied threats. "This is unfortunately common in domestic abuse cases," she said. "Family members often have trouble accepting that someone they trust could be capable of such behavior. It doesn't invalidate your evidence, but it does complicate the situation." She advised me to document Richard's new behavior and consider whether I felt safe staying in the house. "If he knows you're aware of what he's been doing and reporting it to authorities, he might escalate. You should have a safety plan." That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling more isolated and vulnerable than I ever had in my life. I had solid evidence that I was being systematically drugged by someone who was supposed to protect me. I had professional support from doctors and law enforcement, but I lost the most important ally I could have had, my own mother. And now the person who'd been poisoning me knew I was onto him, which meant I was in more danger than ever before. The week following my failed confrontation with Mom was the darkest period of my entire life. I had exposed my investigation to Richard without gaining Mom's support, leaving me more vulnerable and isolated than ever. But what happened next was worse than anything I could have imagined. It started with small acts of psychological warfare. Richard would make comments about my condition in front of Mom, always with a tone of loving concern that made me want to scream. He'd ask how I was sleeping, whether I was remembering to take care of myself, if I was feeling confused about anything lately. "I've been reading about young adults who develop anxiety disorders," he announced over breakfast on Monday. "Sometimes they can cause people to imagine threats that aren't really there. It's more common than you'd think." Mom nodded along sympathetically, shooting me worried glances. "Maybe we should look into finding you a good therapist, sweetheart." I stopped responding to these conversations. What was the point? Every word I said could be twisted into evidence of my alleged mental instability. But Richard wasn't content with just undermining my credibility. On Wednesday evening, I discovered he'd escalated to active sabotage. I was working late in my room, updating my evidence files and corresponding with Detective Romano, when I heard voices downstairs. Mom was on the phone, and she sounded distressed. "Yes, I understand. No, she didn't mention anything to me about missing work. Are you sure it was 3 days? I see. Thank you for calling." My blood ran cold. I crept to the top of the stairs and listened as Mom hung up and immediately called Richard, who was supposedly working late at his office. "Richard, Sarah Chen from Klaye's work just called. She said Klaye hasn't been to work since Monday, and when they called her phone, she gave some vague excuse about a family emergency. But she's been here every morning getting dressed for work like normal." My mind raced. I had been going to work every day. I'd been at the office that very afternoon working on a campaign for a local restaurant. But somehow, my supervisor thought I'd been absent for 3 days. "I'm coming home right now," Richard said, his voice carrying clearly through the phone. "This is exactly what I was worried about. She's losing track of reality, Klaye. She probably thinks she's been going to work, but she's been driving around aimlessly or sitting somewhere for hours." I grabbed my purse and car keys, my hands shaking. I needed to get to the office immediately and figure out what was happening. But when I tried to start my car, the engine made a horrible grinding sound and died completely. Richard arrived home 20 minutes later, just as I was coming back into the house from my failed attempt to start the car. "Car trouble?" he asked, and there was something in his eyes that made me certain this wasn't a coincidence. "It won't start," I said carefully. "That's unfortunate timing, especially since you apparently need to get to work to clear up some confusion about your attendance." The pieces were falling into place. Somehow, Richard had convinced my workplace that I'd been absent. He'd also sabotaged my car to prevent me from going there to prove otherwise. He was systematically cutting me off from the outside world while building a case for my mental incompetence. I called Jessica from my room that night, speaking in whispers. "He's escalating," I told her. "He's trying to make me look crazy by manipulating my work situation and trapping me here." Jessica was quiet for a moment. "Klaye, you need to get out of that house, tonight. Come stay with me until we can figure this out." But when I tried to call a ride service, my phone showed no signal. When I checked the wireless internet, our home network was password protected with a new password I didn't know. I was effectively imprisoned in my own home, with no way to communicate with the outside world except through landlines that Richard could monitor. The next morning, things got worse. Mom sat me down at the kitchen table with the kind of serious expression she used to reserve for discussions about my grades or behavior. "Klaye, we need to talk about getting you some help," she said gently. "Richard found some disturbing things in your room last night." My heart stopped. "What things?" Richard appeared with a manila folder that looked disturbingly familiar. It was my evidence file. All my lab reports, symptom journals, photos, and correspondence with Dr. Hendricks and Detective Romano. "We weren't snooping," Mom said quickly, "but when your work called again this morning asking about your continued absence, Richard thought maybe there were clues in your room about where you've been going instead of work."
Richard spread my carefully compiled evidence across the table like a prosecutor presenting a case. But the narrative he constructed was the exact opposite of what I'd intended. "This shows the extent of Klaye's delusions," he said with what sounded like genuine sadness. "She's created an elaborate fantasy in which I'm somehow drugging her. She's been secretly collecting samples of our coffee and paying for expensive lab tests to prove her paranoid theories." Mom examined the lab reports with new eyes. "Klaye, honey, where did you get the money for all these tests?" I'd paid for the testing with money from my savings account, but before I could answer, Richard continued his twisted interpretation of my evidence. "She's also been lying to medical professionals and law enforcement, making false reports about domestic abuse. Dr. Hendricks confirmed that Klaye came to her with these wild theories, but she was concerned enough about Klaye's mental state to recommend psychological evaluation." "That's not what happened," I protested, but my voice sounded shrill and desperate, even to my own ears.
Richard pulled out printed emails that looked like correspondence with Detective Romano, except they'd been altered somehow. The emails made it appear that the detective was humoring my complaints while expressing private concerns about my mental stability. "The police are required to take all reports seriously," Richard explained to Mom, "but Detective Romano has been documenting what she believes are symptoms of a psychiatric emergency." I stared at the falsified emails in horror. They looked completely authentic, down to the department letterhead and Detective Romano's digital signature. Richard had somehow obtained and altered our real correspondence. "This isn't real," I said, grabbing the papers. "He's changed these emails. Call Detective Romano right now and ask her." But Mom was looking at me with the kind of gentle pity usually reserved for people who were clearly delusional. "Sweetheart, look at what you've been doing. Secret investigations, conspiracy theories, falsified evidence. This isn't rational behavior." The gaslighting was so complete, so expertly crafted, that for a moment I almost believed them myself. Was it possible that I'd been wrong about everything? Could I have been in some kind of dissociative state, creating elaborate fantasies to explain normal stress symptoms? But then I remembered the clarity I'd felt when I stopped drinking the evening coffee. I remembered the scientific precision of the lab results. I remembered Detective Romano's professional concern and Dr. Hendricks' validation of my experiences. "I want to call Dr. Hendricks right now. I want to call Detective Romano. If what you're saying is true, they'll confirm it." Richard exchanged a meaningful look with Mom. "Of course you can call them, kiddo. But first, I think we should get you somewhere safe where you can get the help you need." The word "somewhere" sent ice through my veins. "What do you mean?" Mom reached across the table and took my hand with tears in her eyes. "We've made arrangements for you to stay at Riverside Behavioral Health for a few days, just for evaluation and rest. They specialize in helping young adults who are experiencing psychological crises." A psychiatric hold. They were going to have me committed based on Richard's manufactured evidence of my mental instability. I looked around wildly for escape routes, but Richard was blocking the exit to the front hall, and Mom was between me and the back door. My car was disabled, my phone had no signal, and I was surrounded by people who genuinely believed I was having a psychotic break. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and rational. "Actually, we can," Richard said sadly. "Connecticut law allows for emergency psychiatric holds when someone poses a danger to themselves or others due to mental illness. Your recent behavior, the paranoid accusations, the elaborate conspiracy theories, the apparent inability to distinguish reality from fantasy meets the criteria." He pulled out official-looking paperwork that had already been filled out and signed. Somehow, he'd convinced medical professionals to authorize my involuntary commitment without even examining me. The room seemed to tilt sideways. I realized that Richard hadn't just been drugging me, he'd been planning this endgame for months, carefully building a case for my incompetence while positioning himself as the concerned stepfather trying to help his disturbed stepdaughter. If I were committed to a psychiatric facility, any further accusations I made would be dismissed as the ravings of a mental patient. Richard would have successfully discredited me completely while appearing to be the caring family member seeking help for my condition. "Please don't make this harder than it has to be," Mom said through tears. "We love you, and we just want you to get better." I looked at my mother, really looked at her, and saw that she genuinely believed she was doing the right thing. Richard's manipulation had been so skillful that he'd convinced her to participate in my destruction while thinking she was saving me. That was the moment that everything inside me broke. Not just my trust in Richard, but my faith in my ability to distinguish truth from lies, my confidence in my own perceptions, my belief that justice would prevail if I just gathered enough evidence. I was alone in a way I'd never experienced before, trapped in a nightmare where my own family had become my captors, where seeking help had been turned into evidence of my insanity, where the very clarity that came from avoiding Richard's drugs was being used to prove I was delusional. As I sat at that kitchen table, surrounded by falsified evidence and well-meaning people who wanted to lock me away, I wondered if Richard had already won completely, and if I would ever find a way out of the maze he'd built around my life.
The breakthrough came from the last place I expected, Richard's own arrogance. As I sat at that kitchen table, staring at the falsified documents that would seal my fate, something inside me shifted. Maybe it was the clarity that came from months without his drugs in my system, or maybe it was simply the survival instinct of someone with nothing left to lose. But suddenly, I stopped seeing myself as a victim and started thinking like the investigator I'd trained myself to become. "Before I go anywhere," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I want to understand exactly how this happened. I want to see the original police report that Detective Romano filed, and I want to speak with Dr. Hendricks directly about her evaluation." Richard's expression flickered. Just for a second, but I caught it. It was the look of someone who hadn't expected his victim to ask for verification of details he'd fabricated. "That's not really necessary," he said quickly. "The important thing is getting you help." "It's necessary for me," I insisted. "If I'm really having a psychotic break, then I should understand how professionals reached that conclusion. I want to hear it directly from them." Mom nodded, thinking this sounded reasonable. "That makes sense. We should be able to get copies of the official reports." But Richard was shaking his head. "The psychiatric facility can review all of that with Klaye. Right now, we need to focus on getting her there safely before her condition deteriorates further." His resistance to verification was the first crack in his carefully constructed narrative. I pressed harder. If Detective Romano is really concerned about my mental state, she would have recommended specific procedures for psychiatric evaluation. What exactly did she say about the process? Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She said the family should take immediate action to get you professional help." She said that in an email or in person? In person, when I went to speak with her about our concerns. This was a mistake, and I knew it immediately. Detective Romano had told me explicitly that family members couldn't just walk into the police station and get information about ongoing cases, especially when the family member was potentially the subject of investigation. "When did you meet with her?" I asked. Richard glanced at Mom, then back at me. "Yesterday afternoon, after we realized how serious your condition had become." I pulled out my phone, which had mysteriously regained signal strength in the past few minutes. "Let me call her right now and thank her for her concern." "Klaye, this isn't the time," Richard started, but I was already dialing. Detective Romano answered on the second ring. "Detective Romano, this is Klaye Smith. I'm calling because my stepfather says he met with you yesterday about my mental health concerns, and I wanted to follow up." There was a pause. "Miss Smith, I haven't spoken with anyone from your family except you. I certainly haven't met with your stepfather or made any recommendations about psychiatric evaluation." I put the phone on speaker so Mom could hear. "Detective, could you please repeat that?" "I said I haven't had any contact with your family members. Our department doesn't provide the kind of consultation your stepfather would be claiming. If someone told you I recommended psychiatric commitment, that's completely false." The look on Mom's face was like watching someone's world shift on its axis. For the first time since this nightmare began, she was looking at Richard with confusion instead of trust. "Detective Romano," I continued, "could you please confirm whether the email correspondence between us matches what you actually wrote?" "I can do better than that," she said. "I'm actually on my way to your address right now with a warrant to search the premises. We've been building a case based on your evidence, and we've gathered additional information that supports your accusations." Richard got very still, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Genuine fear. "What kind of additional information?" Mom asked, her voice barely a whisper. Detective Romano's voice was grim.
We found evidence that Mr. Castellano has been obtaining temazepam through fraudulent prescriptions using multiple identities. We also discovered that Miss Smith isn't his first victim. There are 2 previous cases in other states with similar patterns of behavior. The room fell completely silent, except for the sound of Mom's sharp intake of breath. "Previous cases?" she whispered. Mr. Castellano has a pattern of entering relationships with single mothers and targeting their young adult daughters. In both previous instances, the victims reported symptoms identical to what Miss Smith described, but the cases were dropped when family members refused to believe the accusations. I watched Richard's carefully constructed persona crumble in real time. The concerned stepfather mask fell away completely, replaced by cold calculation as he realized his game was over. "This is ridiculous," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Even if I had somehow obtained medication, which I didn't, you can't prove I gave it to anyone."
Detective Romano's voice came through the phone speaker with the authority of someone who had built an airtight case. "Actually, we can. Ms. Smith's systematic evidence collection included coffee samples that retained your fingerprints on the containers. We also have surveillance footage from the pharmacy where you've been picking up fraudulent prescriptions using forged identification." Richard looked around the room like a trapped animal, his gaze moving from the phone to Mom to me to the exits he could no longer reach. "But why?" Mom asked, and her voice was broken in a way that made my heart ache for her. "Why would you do something like this?" For the first time since I'd known him, Richard's mask slipped entirely. What I saw underneath wasn't the caring stepfather or even the calculated predator. It was something much more disturbing. "Control," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You think you can just invite someone into your family and expect them to accept the existing dynamics? Klaye was always going to be a problem. Too independent, too smart, too close to you. She needed to be managed." The casual way he said managed made my skin crawl. I realized that to him, I had never been a person with agency and rights. I had been an obstacle to be handled. "Managed?" Mom repeated, horror growing in her voice. "She was interfering with our relationship," Richard continued, as if explaining something simple to a child. "Always monopolizing your attention, always questioning my decisions, always acting like she knew better than the adults in the house. A little medication made her more manageable, quieter, more compliant, less likely to cause problems." Detective Romano arrived with backup, just as Richard was explaining how drugging me had been a reasonable household management strategy. The casual evil of his reasoning, the complete absence of any recognition that I was a human being rather than a problem to be solved, was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire nightmare. The arrest was swift and professional. Richard didn't resist, but he also didn't show any sign of remorse or recognition that he'd done anything seriously wrong. Even as they read him his rights, he seemed more annoyed by the inconvenience than ashamed of his actions. Mom collapsed into a chair and wept for the betrayal, for the months of her daughter's suffering she'd dismissed, for the man she'd thought she'd married who had never actually existed. "I'm so sorry," she kept saying. "I'm so sorry I didn't believe you." The aftermath was surreal and exhausting. Detective Romano explained that Richard would likely face multiple felony charges: assault with a dangerous weapon, reckless endangerment, obtaining controlled substances through fraud, and several others. The evidence was overwhelming, and with similar cases from his past, he was looking at significant prison time. More importantly for me, the systematic documentation I'd done would serve as a model for other victims. Detective Romano told me that my methodical approach to gathering evidence had been crucial not just for my own case, but for identifying Richard's pattern of behavior across multiple states. In the days that followed, I learned details about Richard's past that made my stomach turn. He had indeed targeted single mothers with young adult daughters before. His method was always the same: charm his way into the family, establish himself as a caring stepfather figure, then systematically drug the daughter to make her more manageable, while building a case for her mental instability if she ever became suspicious. The other victims had been less fortunate than me. Without the kind of systematic evidence I'd collected, their accusations had been dismissed as mental health issues or family conflicts. Richard had simply moved on to new targets when the situations became too complicated. Dr. Hendricks helped me understand the long-term effects of the drugging.
The tempozapam levels Richard had been giving me were significant enough to cause genuine cognitive impairment, memory problems, and personality changes. The fact that I'd been able to recognize something was wrong and investigate it effectively was, in her words, remarkable given the chemical constraints you were operating under. Recovery was a gradual process. It took months for my natural sleep patterns and energy levels to fully return. It took even longer to rebuild trust in my own perceptions and judgment. But slowly, with the help of therapy and the unwavering support of people like Jessica and Dr. Hendricks, I began to feel like myself again. Mom and I had a long road to healing our relationship. She'd been manipulated too, though in different ways, and she struggled with guilt about not protecting me. But we worked through it together, both of us learning to trust again, her learning to trust my voice, and me learning to trust that someone could genuinely care about my well-being. Richard was sentenced to 12 years in prison. During the trial, 2 more victims came forward, women who had been too afraid to speak up before, but found courage in seeing someone successfully prosecute their abuser. The judge called his crimes a calculated campaign of domestic terrorism against vulnerable young women. Today, I work as an advocate for victims of domestic drugging, helping other people recognize the signs and navigate the complex process of gathering evidence and seeking justice. It's not the career path I planned, but it's deeply meaningful work that grew directly from my own experience. The most important thing I learned through this nightmare is that trusting yourself is not selfish or paranoid. It's essential. When everyone around you is saying you're wrong, when the evidence seems impossible to believe, when speaking up threatens relationships you value, sometimes you still have to trust the voice inside that says something isn't right. Your life, your safety, and your sanity are worth defending, even when, especially when, the threat comes from someone who claims to love you. I still drink coffee every morning, but I always make it myself.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.